When someone as steady as Morgan Freeman suddenly looks unbalanced, you know something serious is unfolding fast. This is a man whose voice has carried authority, wisdom, and calm for decades, making his recent appearance even more jarring for those who saw it. It wasn't acting. It was the raw reality of a man watching a nightmare finally break into daylight. For months, the story around Rob Reiner's passing had been wrapped in polite language and soft edges, with public statements leaning on words meant to ease the shock and lower the temperature. But Morgan Freeman didn't follow that script at all. He stepped forward to tear straight through the packaging, forcing everyone to look at what had been sitting underneath the surface this whole time. The tragedy that struck the Reiner household on the 14th of December 2025 wasn't just a sudden explosion of violence. It was a long-ignored descent that ended in the upscale Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. While headlines keep circling the cold technical details of the investigation, Freeman has focused on something deeper: the patterns of pressure and years of enabling that slowly built toward this catastrophic ending. He didn't step forward to offer recycled sympathy. He spoke because he believed the silence surrounding Nick Reiner wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Freeman's words hit with such force because he isn't just a casual industry connection. He shared a real bond with Rob Reiner that was forged during the filming of The Bucket List. That project, which centered on endings and legacy, led to late-night conversations where Rob spoke openly about his children. Freeman noticed even then that whenever Nick's name came up, the energy shifted and the air went cold. He studies behavior and tension for a living, and what he has revealed about the Reiner household reframes everything the public thought they understood about this legendary family. At the center of this tragedy is Nick Reiner, a 32-year-old man who now stands accused of the double murder of his parents, filmmaker Rob Reiner and photographer Michelle Singer Reiner. Appearing in court in a brown prison outfit with his hair newly shorn, Nick has occasionally offered a grim smile while staring ahead through the proceedings. This behavior is why Freeman's words stop feeling like simple commentary and start feeling like a warning that came far too late. Freeman has pushed back hard against the neat narrative that this was a sudden break or a random spiral. In his view, this was calculation, not confusion. By breaking the wall of silence that typically protects powerful Hollywood families, Freeman has positioned himself as a powerful voice before the trial even begins in earnest. He is calling out an entire system that kept cushioning a dangerous presence, from friends who slipped Nick money to industry connections who kept reopening doors that should have stayed closed. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a memorial for a family dynamic that was slowly eroded from the inside. It's a warning about what happens when love keeps stepping forward while boundaries keep stepping back, and why turning away is no longer an option for anyone who truly respected Rob Reiner. To understand why Morgan Freeman felt compelled to break his silence, we have to look back at the chilling sequence of events that unfolded in the winter of 2025. The Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles is known for its quiet, tree-lined streets and fortified gates. A place where the world's most famous creators go to find sanctuary. But on December 14, that sanctuary was shattered in a way that the film industry is still struggling to comprehend. The discovery of the bodies of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner inside their own home was not a scene of peaceful passing, but one of brutal and inexplicable violence. Reports from those close to the investigation described a scene that was stripped of all humanity. Yet what stood out most to those who knew Rob was the lack of defensive posture. Morgan Freeman pointed out a detail that changes the entire emotional weight of the event. There were no clear signs that Rob tried to protect himself from the onslaught. In the world of forensics, a lack of struggle usually implies a profound level of trust. It suggests that even in his final seconds, Rob could not believe his own son would actually cross that terminal line. He wasn't bracing for harm. He was likely standing in front of his child, still trying to use the tools of a father: patience, connection, and calm, to pull a volatile young man back from the edge. Freeman's voice falters when describing this because it reveals the unbearable reality of a man who refused to believe the worst until it was unavoidable. The timeline leading up to that night reveals a series of social interactions that, in hindsight, were screaming with red flags. Just hours before the tragedy, there were accounts of Nick Reiner's behavior being described as increasingly erratic and unsettling. At a private gathering, the tension was said to be instant and suffocating the moment Nick entered the room. Industry insiders recalled how Rob, usually the most boisterous and commanding presence in any environment, seemed to physically shrink and fold into himself when his son was near. It was a portrait of a man who was untouchable in the professional world but deeply afraid within the walls of his own family. When the authorities finally arrived at the Brentwood property, the images that surfaced were a far cry from the polished legacy of the man who directed some of the most beloved films in American history. Instead of the warmth of a Hollywood household, there was only the cold, technical reality of a double murder investigation. Nick Reiner, at 32 years old, was taken into custody and eventually appeared in court for the second time, facing the gravity of his actions. He sat there in a brown prison outfit, hunched over with his hair shorn, occasionally casting a grim smile toward the gallery. It was this specific lack of remorse that Freeman suggests confirms his theory that the act was not a result of a sudden mental break, but a calculated movement by someone who knew exactly how to navigate his parents' vulnerabilities. Freeman's account sharply diverges from the official summaries that try to soften the blow for the public. While the media focused on the shock of the loss, Freeman focused on the mechanics of the betrayal. He reveals that Nick knew the house like muscle memory. He knew the routines, the access points, and the emotional triggers that would make his mother offer comfort instead of calling for help. He knew that if pressure was applied, his father would respond with resources and fixes rather than building the walls that were actually necessary for safety. This tragedy wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the final exploitation of a father's decency by a son who had learned that there were no consequences he couldn't outrun. The weight of this event is compounded by the fact that it happened in a place of supposed peace. Freeman refers to the Reiner home as a sacred space, a foundation that had been warm and stable for decades. To have that foundation overwhelmed by an internal intrusion is what makes the situation impossible to rationalize. It leaves a hole in the heart of Hollywood that cannot be filled by recycled sympathy or polite public statements. It requires the kind of uncomfortable honesty that only a peer of Freeman's stature could provide, ensuring that the world understands that while Rob Reiner ended his life reaching for someone he loved, the person he reached for was already gone. The relationship between Morgan Freeman and Rob Reiner was not merely a professional courtesy between two industry titans. It was a friendship forged in the crucible of a shared creative vision. Their bond solidified during the filming of The Bucket List, a movie that explored the profound themes of reflection, legacy, and the weight of unfinished business. Freeman recalls that during long nights on set, the conversations would often drift away from the script and toward the realities of their own lives. It was in these quiet moments that Rob spoke most openly about his children. But Freeman noticed a recurring and chilling pattern. Whenever the subject of Nick came up, the warmth that usually defined Rob would vanish, replaced by a cold energy and a visible shift in his posture. Freeman, who has spent his entire career observing human behavior and the nuances of silence, could see the cracks in the family facade long before they became public. He recently admitted that while the world saw a successful Hollywood family, he saw a father who was constantly handing his son the glue to fix recurring disasters, even while knowing deep down that the repairs would never hold. This perspective reframes the entire friendship as one where Freeman acted as a silent witness to a slow-motion catastrophe. He watched as Rob, a man with endless influence and the power to command any room, became increasingly vulnerable within his own household. One of the most haunting revelations Freeman shared was a private dinner that took place 3 years before the tragedy, an event that had never before been made public. In a room filled with industry insiders, Nick Reiner arrived without warning, and the atmosphere reportedly became instant and suffocating. Freeman described the scene as if danger had quietly taken a seat at the table. Perhaps most disturbing was the reaction of Rob Reiner himself, who was typically the loudest and most vibrant presence in any setting. Instead of greeting his son with the usual parental affection, Rob folded into himself, his voice lowering, and his posture changing, as if he were trying to become invisible. It was at that moment that Freeman realized his friend was living in a state of profound fear inside his own home. The depth of this fear was further confirmed just weeks before the final unraveling. Freeman revealed that Rob reached out to him in the middle of the night, not for a casual check-in, but with a call filled with desperation and confusion. During this conversation, Rob kept circling back to hypothetical questions that Freeman knew were grounded in a terrifying reality. He was asking about boundaries, about the point where parental love becomes a source of danger, and whether it was ever truly acceptable to shut the door on your own child to save yourself. It was a plea for permission from a man who felt trapped by his own compassion. Freeman did not hold back in his advice, telling Rob to focus on keeping Michelle safe and to finally put distance between the family and the chaos that Nick brought with him. However, Freeman could sense that Rob was not built to walk away. The same empathy that allowed him to create masterworks like Stand By Me was the very trait that prevented him from building the walls necessary for survival. Nick reportedly understood this emotional machinery perfectly, knowing exactly which buttons to press to ensure that his father would choose resources and reconciliation over safety. The tragedy of this bond lies in the fact that Freeman saw the ending coming, but was powerless to rewrite it. He carries the weight of those last conversations, wondering if he should have been more forceful, or if he should have physically intervened before the Christmas season arrived. Now, Freeman refuses to let the industry gloss over the reality of what Rob endured. He is using the credibility of his voice to ensure that the man who created joy for millions is remembered not just for his films, but for the immense personal burden he carried out of love for a son who, according to Freeman, never learned how to love him back. Morgan Freeman's indignation isn't just focused on the perpetrator. It is aimed at the very walls of the Hollywood social circle that he believes allowed this danger to fester. He has openly criticized the system of enabling that kept Nick Reiner insulated from the real-world consequences of his actions for over a decade. In Freeman's view, the Reiner name acted as a shield, creating a double standard where behavior that would have led to institutionalization or incarceration for anyone else was instead met with endless second chances and elite safety nets. Freeman pointedly referenced an industry culture that prioritizes reputation over intervention. He suggested that many within their shared circle knew Nick was unstable, having been in and out of rehab at least 18 times since the age of 15, yet they continued to offer him financial support and professional opportunities. Freeman noted that even after Rob Reiner finally attempted to draw a firm line, certain friends and industry connections continued to slip Nick money, effectively undermining the family's attempts to force accountability. This architecture of enabling, as Freeman describes it, left Rob and Michelle alone to navigate the consequences of a problem the entire community helped feed. The silence of other major figures in the wake of the tragedy has been equally telling. While longtime friends and collaborators like Billy Crystal, Albert Brooks, and Larry David issued a joint statement praising Rob and Michelle's legacy and unselfish nature, they have remained notably silent regarding the specifics of Nick's history that Freeman has chosen to expose. This silence, according to Freeman, is a continuation of the same protective instinct that allowed the situation to escalate. By contrast, Freeman has chosen to dismantle the polished script of Hollywood mourning, arguing that preserving a legacy is impossible if the industry continues to hide the uncomfortable truths that led to its destruction. Freeman also addressed the legal maneuvers already taking shape. He pushed back against any narrative that might frame Nick as merely misunderstood or a victim of his environment. He emphasized that Nick had access to every conceivable advantage: top-tier recovery programs, elite therapy, and financial security. Despite these resources, Nick's history included being under a mental health conservatorship in 2020. Yet he remained in a position where he could eventually commit an act of such finality. For Freeman, the most painful aspect of this enabling was the institutional betrayal. He hinted at incidents at private events where Nick's aggressive behavior was brushed aside to avoid embarrassing his legendary father. This pattern of reputation protection created a vacuum of accountability that Freeman believes sealed the family's fate. He warned that if the industry doesn't learn from this, if it continues to value the last name over the safety of the household, then the tragedy in Brentwood will not be the last of its kind. Morgan Freeman's insights suggest that the tragedy in Brentwood may have been precipitated by more than just long-standing tension. It may have been triggered by a specific moment of artistic honesty that Nick Reiner could not endure. Freeman alluded to a final, deeply personal project that Rob Reiner had been working on in the months leading up to his death. A script that reportedly functioned as a mirror for the family's internal struggles. While Rob and Nick had previously collaborated on the 2015 film Being Charlie to process Nick's history with addiction, Freeman hints that this new work was different, lacking the hopeful resolution of their earlier collaboration. This mirror script allegedly depicted a character whose entitlement and volatility were not presented as temporary phases to be cured, but as a corrosive reality that was draining the life from those around him. Freeman's commentary suggests that if Nick discovered these pages, he would have seen himself not as a misunderstood protagonist, but as the source of his parents' profound exhaustion. For someone whose identity was reportedly built on a rebellious, angry, drug-addicted persona, being confronted with his father's unfiltered perspective may have been the ultimate insult to his ego. The timing of the final confrontation supports the theory of a specific catalyst. Just the night before the bodies were discovered, Rob and Nick attended a Christmas party at the home of Conan O'Brien. Witnesses described Nick's behavior as freaking everyone out, and a very loud argument erupted between father and son, with Rob reportedly chastising Nick for his inappropriate conduct. Freeman frames this not as an isolated spat, but as the moment the glue Rob had been using to hold the family together finally gave way to the truth. Freeman has been vocal in rejecting the inevitable legal defense that will likely focus on Nick's mental health. While it has been confirmed that Nick was under a mental health conservatorship as recently as 2020 and had been prescribed medication for schizophrenia, Freeman argues that these conditions do not negate the calculation he saw in Nick's actions. He points to the lack of defensive wounds on Rob as evidence that the intrusion was carried out by someone who knew exactly how to exploit the trust and peace of the household. In Freeman's telling, this script was Rob's attempt to finally put his reality onto the page. But honesty proved to be dangerous, in a space where denial had been allowed to grow for years. By choosing to speak out about these hidden details, Freeman is ensuring that the narrative doesn't become a simplified story of a mental break. Instead, he portrays it as the tragic conclusion of a storyteller who understood warning signs and unresolved tension, but who ultimately could not rewrite his own ending. As 2026 begins, the legal proceedings against Nick Reiner have taken a series of sudden and perplexing turns that have left both the public and industry insiders searching for answers. On the 7th of January 2026, the case was thrust back into the spotlight during what was supposed to be Nick's formal arraignment at the Los Angeles Superior Court. Instead of entering a plea, the courtroom witnessed the abrupt withdrawal of high-profile defense attorney Alan Jackson. Jackson, a veteran known for representing figures like Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, cited circumstances beyond our control and circumstances beyond Nick's control as the reasons it had become impossible to continue the representation. While he remained legally and ethically prohibited from explaining the specific cause, Jackson made a striking public declaration outside the courthouse, telling reporters to take it to the bank that under California law, Nick Reiner is not guilty of murder. The visual of Nick Reiner in the courtroom during this transition was a stark contrast to the polished image of the Reiner family legacy. No longer wearing the blue suicide prevention smock from his initial appearance in December, Nick stood behind a glass screen in a brown jail jumpsuit, his head completely shaved. Though the judge prohibited cameras from capturing his face directly, witnesses noted he appeared somewhat detached, occasionally standing on his tiptoes to peer over his lawyers' heads at the gathered audience. This behavior, combined with reports that he had been taken off suicide watch just days prior, has fueled ongoing speculation about his mental fitness to stand trial. With Jackson's departure, the court has appointed Deputy Public Defender Kimberly Green to take over the defense. This shift has resulted in the arraignment being postponed for a second time, now rescheduled for the 23rd of February 2026. Legal experts have suggested that the transition to a public defender might stem from the immense financial burden of such a complex case, with some estimates suggesting a full trial defense could cost between $5 and $10 million. Furthermore, California's Slayer statute could potentially block Nick from accessing his parents' estate to fund his defense if a probate court determines he is responsible for their deaths. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Habib Balian, remains steadfast in its pursuit of first-degree murder charges, which carry special circumstances of multiple murders and the use of a deadly weapon. While District Attorney Nathan Hochman has stated he is fully confident a jury will convict Nick unanimously, the office has not yet decided whether to seek the death penalty. As the February hearing approaches, the focus is expected to shift toward Nick's documented history of mental health struggles, including a previous mental health conservatorship in 2020 and 2021, and reports that his medication for schizophrenia was being adjusted in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. For Morgan Freeman and those watching closely, these legal hurdles are merely the next chapter in a story that has already reframed the limits of parental love and the devastating consequences of ignored warning signs. As the spotlight begins to fade from the initial shock of the Brentwood crime scene and shifts toward the sterile, cold reality of a February trial date, Morgan Freeman's words remain as the definitive closing argument of the public conscience. He didn't speak to shock the world. He spoke so that the truth of who Rob and Mikhail Reiner were could not be reshaped or softened by a defense team seeking to mitigate the unspeakable. In Freeman's view, the legacy of Rob Reiner isn't just found in the timeless humor of Princess Bride or the emotional depth of Stand By Me. It is found in the immense, quiet courage it took for a father to keep loving a child who had become a stranger to peace. Freeman's closing thought on the matter is a haunting reminder of the limits of human intervention. He reflects on the fact that while we often talk about the power of love to heal all wounds, we rarely discuss the point where that same love becomes a source of extreme vulnerability. By breaking the silence, Freeman has drawn a clear line in the sand for the rest of Hollywood. Loyalty to the living must never come at the expense of the truth regarding the dead. He wants the world to remember Rob for his limitless capacity for joy and his unyielding belief in the goodness of people, even when that belief was tested by the very person who shared his DNA. The story of the Reiner family is no longer just a headline about a celebrity tragedy. It is a profound lesson in boundaries, the dangers of enabling, and the weight of a legacy that was both a blessing and a shield. Nick Reiner will face his judgment in a court of law on February 23, where his defense will likely lean into the complexities of his mental health and the failures of the systems meant to protect him. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict has already been delivered with painful clarity by the man who knew the family best. This tragedy forces an uncomfortable conversation that most of us would rather avoid. What do you do when the person you love becomes the greatest threat to your safety? It is a question that Rob Reiner wrestled with in the quiet of his Brentwood home, and it is a question that Morgan Freeman has now brought into the light for the entire world to witness. As we look forward to the legal proceedings, we must hold on to the humanity of the victims, ensuring that their names are synonymous with the love they gave, not just the manner in which they were taken. If you have followed this journey with us, we want to hear your perspective. Do you believe that the Hollywood system of privilege played a role in this tragic outcome? Or was this an unavoidable collision of mental health and circumstance? Morgan Freeman's brave decision to speak out has changed the way we view this case, and your thoughts are a vital part of the ongoing conversation. Make sure to hit the like button if you found this deep dive informative. Share this video to help spread the truth about this complex story, and subscribe to Memories of the Stars so you never miss an update on this developing situation. Your engagement helps us continue to tell the stories that matter, with the depth and respect they deserve.